In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this Japanese inspired Zendo room. This is a project that I did and started with all my raw materials. I had a series of plans where I planned to make what's called a tea house configuration and some tatami mats. The basic configuration was going to be a roughly 2.7 meter by 2.7 meter area within a newly refurbished area of my house. And I had the plans so that the rear window was going to align up with the height of the tatami, and so that the actual building plans and electricals and things were designed around having a Zendo room and having that dimension in that space of the area. The tatami mats I imported from Japan, so I've got four full pieces. Each tatami is 900 mil by 1800 mil, and then I've got a half piece as well which goes in the center. On the floor I've used a mass loaded vinyl, which you see me cutting up here, and that's going to be used as strips to go underneath the floor joists, mainly to provide a little bit of extra spacing to eliminate any creaks or any other noise that might transfer from walking on the tatami through down into the floor area. So I've spaced out all my floor joists. I've used 120 mil wide pine, and measuring them all out, I'm going to connect it and screw it into the skirting on the sides and use bugle screws to connect all the pine joists together. It's a pretty simple configuration. I've used about 500 mil centers between everything, and it's really just about trying to spread the load for the structure floor, which is going to go over the top. I draw out all my plans and dimensions before I start any of these projects. The most important one was here, is this was designed before my house was renovated, so I knew that this size dimension had to fit in this area, and therefore the house plans were actually designed to accommodate a Zendo room into that space. And that's where the windows and the door all started, so there was clearance around the room. Here it's attaching to the skirting, and the whole thing is really solid into the wall. There's no movement whatsoever. Checking everything's square before finalizing, and then sliding the mass loaded vinyl strips underneath to have a little bit of cushioning for the whole frame area. This time is bringing in the structure floor. This comes in sheets and has a yellow tongue and groove that slots together, which just allows you to knock them in with a mallet. It's pretty simple. It gives a really firm base for the tatami so that there's no movement or any echoing or anything when you walk on top of it. The structure floor is just then screwed down into the floor joists. And then I've now just laid out the tatami in the configuration. This is just testing for spacing at this stage. I've just laid them out because I'm going to build a little holding frame using 30 by 30 mil pine, which is just going to hold, and you see those pieces there, it's just holding the tatami in rigid in place before I put a framing board around it. And then the whole area is going to have the same timber flooring, this oak flooring. I grabbed another box from the flooring supplier and wrapped the whole Zendo area in the same materials as what the timber floor is done in. So that's the 30 by 30 mil pine. It's on each of the sides going the whole way around. And once they're in place, then I could get the measurements for doing the trim as well. So slotting those in, and the last one to drop in was to make sure that the half tatami piece fit nicely into the middle. I'm using Tasmanian oak, which I use for a lot of my projects, for the edge banding or the edge piece. It's got to be a nice substantial piece because the edge where you can actually step on the other side needs to be very securely in place. And the height of the structure floor, as well as the tatami and the 30 by 30 mil pine, meant that the Tasmanian oak piece sits flush with the tatami. So my plans that you saw earlier on, which you can pause and look at if you want, that was done so that I would have the edge piece here lined up perfectly with the height of the tatami. Cutting miter on the floor piece, and then I just cut it around the skirting to get a nice seamless look, and that turned out really well. On the edge piece here, we want to get a nice look, so I'll show you a trick in a minute how that comes together. And this is just an early look at getting my table on. All the side pieces of the timber flooring were liquid nails on to the timber joist. And it's sort of hard to, there's no sort of way to clamp that on because of the way that it's just sitting up against the piece. But I just glued the edges, you can see there. And then I'm also going to just put a few pin nails through into the unit once it's up and ready. So that was a little bit of a tricky moment to get that up all in one piece and aligned properly. But I was really happy with how the edge piece came together and how it looks when it wraps up from the floor to the side of the Zendo. I've done a few pin nails along, it's not really trying to do too much other than hold it in so the liquid nails can take effect. And then a couple on the very edge. Here I'm just using a screwdriver to round over the edge piece so that once you close up that little gap in the miter by pushing the wood fibers together, you cannot see the gap there at all. It's held really, really well, and it's a great little trick. There's the gap in, or the join in the timber floor pieces. So now we've got the starting to see the look. This is a very early look at my house when the wall area that you'll see later on hasn't yet been done. So cutting the trim to size and putting that in place. And once that's done, final adjustments to get the edge piece. Bringing that in, testing all the edges. And I wanted to get a nice round over so the whole thing didn't have any sharpness to the edge. So I used quite a large round over bit to do this with my router. And doing another last test fit. I haven't stained it yet, so this is again just doing a pure test fit before I did apply all the stain and the final finish to it. I did 3 coats of a stain and varnish, and I try to use a quite dark color called Black Japan. I've used this on a couple of different pieces that I've got in the house, so it ties together pretty nicely. And the way I'm going to hold the trim in, you can see here, I'm using the dowel little guide so that you can get a little marker of where the location is to then drill your dowel hole. I'm using dowels along the length of each of these pieces on the 2 front edges, as well as gluing it. So this is just a test fit at the moment. And you can see the height sort of matches perfectly against the tatami. Once that was ready to do a final glue up, I've glued the edge of the floorboard, I've glued the dowels, and there's also liquid nails along the top of the 30 by 30 mil pine. So there's a few different things that are all holding it in place, because the edge does overhang from the floorboard underneath. So as people, which they do, they stand on that bit, it can't over time pull away or have any sort of damage done to it. It's held really well. Just putting as much weight on it to dry, and then doing the other sides, same thing, drilling for the dowels, gluing it up, putting it in place, and then trying to get some weight on it while the glue holds. By now I've also got my Japanese seating and zabuton cushions in place. My table and the seating and the tatami were all imported from Japan. Don't ever get cheap tatami. It's not worth it. And the final look here, you can see that edge. The edge here is that's the bit that ties everything together, that makes it look really polished. So I put a lot of time into making sure I got that bit as perfect as I could with the round over pieces and just the amount that it ties in and it doesn't have any gaps. So the project's pretty much done at this point, but the final difference is I then finished the wall that is behind the whole unit with a series of floating shelves that are all 3 meters long. They're massively long shelves, and they have LED lights on the undersides of them. I've got 8 shelves in total that run up that wall, and a collection of vinyl figures that sits on top of it. The Japanese table was also one that I restored, even though I did import it from Japan. It was in fairly rough condition, so I refinished the whole top and did that all again, and also re-glued all the legs and redid some of the dowels to make that all look fairly new, to be honest. It came up really well. Part of the positioning of the room is also that the Zendo room overlooks my outdoor pool area, so it's a really great spot. It takes the afternoon sun. It's a nice, really warm spot. It's got a fantastic view over the pool, and it's got blinds that come down if you just want to have some shade. I was really happy with how it turned out. Zendo room, I don't know if it's an official term. It's just the misconception my architect had when I described what I wanted into this space, and he had no idea what I was talking about. I was just talking about having a Japanese tatami area. It ended up being called Zendo.